Hi everyone, welcome. I'm down here in my wormery, and out here on the bench in front of me I got a couple of worm bins we're going to be checking in on today and feeding. But before we do, I was going to share with you a little bit of info. As you can see, I've already got my glove on, I'm all set to go, but before we tip the camera down to look at the bins, I thought I'd share some stats about the two bins with you. These are the European Nightcrawler worm bins, in which for the past 113 days we've been composting a wool sweater. And the wool sweater was cut in half so that each bin can get half of it. And after 113 days, if this had been a cotton garment, my guess is that it would have been gone. But up until the last check-in, which was just a couple weeks ago, 14 days ago, it seemed like there was hardly, if any, progress on the sweater. So kind of makes me wonder if perhaps the test should have started sooner. Anybody interested in seeing any more of the info pertaining to how long the system was in composting mode relative to the most recent phase that it's in, which is foraging, which just means no new bedding. It was right there for you to see. Basically 26 weeks, 182 days, the equivalent of half a year, 6 months, was how long we applied the feedings with bedding. And then more recently, over the past 7 weeks, 49 days, we've been withholding the bedding. So as you were able to see, we replaced the plastic covers last time in such a way that they allowed for a little bit of airflow around the edges in the hopes that perhaps the systems would lose a little bit of their moisture content to evaporation, because like many of my systems, these systems were beginning to feel a little bit heavy, starting to feel a little bit muddy, and on many instances in the past couple weeks we've switched from plastic covers over to paper covers. Over here too, you can see these little discolorations of kind of white little specks. Those are springtails, and the springtails are often a sign that perhaps the system is a little bit overly damp. So last time too, we even suggested that maybe it was time to swap the plastic covers and put something on in the place of them that would allow for some moisture loss to evaporation. In most cases for me that is newspaper, and I didn't really prepare with newspaper top coverings. In a way, I thought we might just continue with the plastic in such a way that we return it to the bin the way we left it last time, just a little bit offset from the edges, permitting some moisture loss to occur. Now the systems were fed last time with a assortment of foods that are almost identical to what they're getting today, because last time they got coffee, which they're getting again today, and last time they received a couple of these little mini cucumbers. I think they're called Kirby. Here, this is one of those larger cucumbers which I chopped up into multiple pieces. The cucumber came from my freezer and the coffee did not. To me, it just doesn't seem like freezing coffee would gain any benefit. But we did freeze the cucumber, and that cucumber's been in my freezer for some time now. I thought that, perhaps today would be the day that we finally deploy it. And what I've been doing is just putting the foods that these worms get straight onto the wool sweater in the hopes that we can drive traffic onto the wool sweater. Now I know that this sweater had some moth damage, and that's the reason it was sort of removed from the donor's wardrobe and added to our supply of experimental worm composting materials. And I saw those two holes where I kind of put my blue glove behind the holes so they could see the size of the holes. I don't know if those could have been holes that were caused by moth damage way back when. That's the trick to this, is that it's hard to tell, But I do wonder, I've actually asked this on numerous occasions, I think, at least once though, even if it hasn't been multiple times, but if you, the viewers, have any experience composting wool, I'd really love to hear if what we're seeing here with this wool sweater is in line with what you would expect relative to what you observed and experienced with your own wool fabric composting experiences. Because this is my first time. I believe it was the most recent cotton composting experiment in which we observed a couple t-shirts going from, you know, full-size garments to being gone, completely consumed by the worms in the worm bins in about 100 days. And here we've definitely surpassed that amount of time with virtually no progress showing, leading me back to something one of the viewers asked. So here too we could see some more holes, pretty prominent holes. So what was asked was what would become of this sweater if we decided it was time to bring these systems to an end, harvest the castings and move the worms on. Well, I think it would be fair to not abandon the experiment, but, you know, allow it to proceed with the same worms in their new home. And after 7 weeks of foraging with no new bedding going in here, the material is growing more and more fine. I mean, I do see some evidence of bedding materials that had been used in the past, mainly the stems of leaves. And other than that, I would seriously doubt that we'd see any other sorts of bedding materials remaining in here. I mean, the stems of leaves almost don't even seem like bedding. They just seem like something that comes along for the ride when you decide to use leaves as bedding. Some of these stems are pretty big. So perhaps as long as it's in my hand already, I'll just snap it. But there are so many of them all over the place. Oh my goodness. I've got a phone call coming in. So let's get to giving them their lovely cucumber and coffee meal. It seems like we created a somewhat larger opening in bin number 2 for the feeding. Man, there is a lot of moisture in here. I'm wondering if we might just return the plastic covers in such a way that they really only cover the feeding zone, if that's even necessary anymore with this much moisture in here. I mean, I'm definitely a believer in the fact that the more moisture you have, the more healthy the system is going to be as far as the worms having a ample supply of oxygen, because they breathe through their skins by, I guess, in some way extracting the oxygen from the moisture that they're in contact with. That's just something I don't know the details of, but as far as I know, that's the way they breathe. So keeping things moist, at least over the experiment, seems like it would make good sense. Or maybe it is time to start thinking about actually bringing these systems to an end and not worrying so much about keeping things moist, but rather starting to allow things to become a little bit more dry and flaky and manageable, so that we could at some point see the systems to completion. To me, it just seems like if we're going to harvest the system, and for me, harvesting the castings usually means evacuating them by getting the worms to move out voluntarily, usually using the migration approach. Then you give that migration approach a leg up, or a better chance at being successful in a reasonable amount of time by allowing the system to become a little bit drier and kind of trigger a response within the worms for them to try, you know, seeking out a space that's a little bit more comfortable for them to be in. And by that I just mean a space that's a little bit more damp, which would be the space in the bin that was set up to lure them over the horizontal migration feeding zone. So in went the cucumber, in went the coffee. What I just sprinkled in was a little bit of my worm chow, and then on top of all that, I'm adding grit, and that's going to be their feeding today. So let's backfill, and now we get a little chance to examine the material out here. I always get caught off guard and a little bit surprised when I see how many springtails are within this super damp material. And I'm really starting to get that feeling like perhaps it is time to abandon the plastic covers, as we've hinted at. Definitely in the last feeding, perhaps even other feedings that came prior. For something that would allow for a little bit of drying to start happening here. My hope is that if we do permit a little bit of drying to occur, that what's happening here, this muddiness and clumpiness, will go away, with the worms just sort of traveling through the material and aerating and breaking it apart. But this is definitely way too damp, if you ask me. So I think part of us bringing this check-in to its conclusion is going to include giving me a little bit of homework, which will be to craft a couple replacement covers out of some kind of paper. I have plenty of newspaper, but I've also got some paper bag type material that we could possibly use here. I'll have to decide and pick whatever seems best. Perhaps the newspaper, being a little bit thinner, I believe, than the paper bag material, would be beneficial to allow for even more moisture loss than if we used some sort of a thicker piece of paper. So I think that's the way we're going to go. But that'll be done off camera after we finish here. And I think the last thing I'm going to do here is actually kind of mildly deviate from my concept of foraging, which means no new bedding, by sort of sneaking in something that the worms might be able to utilize as bedding, which is something that I refer to as a feeding zone indicator. And it's really just a piece of paper, a coffee filter in this case, marking where we last fed. And should the worms really be in dire need of something like that, in addition to the lovely kitchen scraps they've been fed, if they wanted to nibble on something like these pieces of paper, then at least it's there for them. So that's it for the check-in, everyone. I've got a little bit of homework to do in terms of getting some paper covers on here. I'll also make sure that no worms are stranded on those plastics that we're retiring at this point. But other than that, we're done. So hopefully you enjoyed the video. If you did, as always, please don't forget to leave me a quick thumbs up before you go. That's always really appreciated. And if you haven't done so already, please also consider subscribing to the channel. That's very much appreciated as well. All right, everyone, thanks for watching. Have a great day. Bye now.